Okay. Thank you. You just suspended the recording. So it's the co-host is working, which is good. Okay. So welcome everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. This is the 21st of December, and this is the Object Storage Working Group. Let's get this started with the agenda items. So the first items are the action items for last week. So we had this ongoing effort. The first one is describing the current status of the object storage, where Matthias was mostly working on tidying things up and making sure that we collect all the information. I wrote my thoughts on it. And I think that the main takeaway is that there is more than what we expected, in the sense that we had documentation about uploads, and that documentation is mostly thinking at the problem from user uploading something. While going through the code, trying to figure out what we have there are extra use cases like data that is getting generated from the system itself, not necessarily in reaction to a user upload. And this is kind of the asynchronous type of upload that is mentioned in the documentation, but it has a different flavor, because in that case, we always think about user uploads something, and then we have to process that something. This is quite different. It's an extra use case. Another thing that surprised me is that we also have a direct fog usage in one feature only, which is the live trace, which is kind of unique, but it's something to keep in mind. And then we have file level encryption, which is on Terraform. Yeah, Terraform state files. So these are the things that surprised me. Out of this, for sure, we should update the documentation to mention that there is this extra use case, and that are kind of, yeah, I mean, we know a bit more about the usage of object storage and uploads in general compared to when we started. Anyone has question, remarks on this before we move to the next item?
I have one question. It's related to the point number 5, which I added just a moment ago, about updating the blueprint. I feel like the blueprint we have right now is kind of outdated based on what we have learned recently. We are also not confident that the solutions and iterations described there are also something like, we want to actually implement. So yeah, so that's the only remark I hear here, that I have here, that actually after learning about the current state, we could document it better in the blueprint.
I have no strong opinion on where is the right place to document this. So if we think that the blueprint is the right one, let's go for the blueprint. I mean, the blueprint was mostly there for describing the problems. Problems are the ones that are described. The solution are marked as these are some hypothetical directions we can take, but the DRI is the working group, so we can definitely update that one.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the blueprint should not contain a lot of technical details and implementation details, but I still feel like it's a bit outdated. So yeah, if I find time this year, I will try to propose some changes to the blueprint. So that's my idea.
Thank you, Gregors.
How about making sure that the investigation is linked inside of the blueprint and the actual documentation is updated? We have some documentation that is talking about the types of object storage processing we are doing. So maybe we can, or rather, I'm suggesting that maybe we leave blueprint as is, apart from the fact that something came out of it, right? Like it was a starting point. We took these steps, we found this new information, and linked to updated documentation that is a persistent location for the docs that are supposed to be up to date.
Yeah, so I think we should actually update both documentation and the blueprint. The updates do not need to be extensive, but it feels like some docs are not up to date, so we should fix that.
In a documentation page, we mentioned that object storage is not available on Community Edition, which was kind of surprising back in 2018. Okay, point number B, collecting requirements. So Gregors, up to you.
So I did some initial requirements gathering in this Google spreadsheet linked in there. I do realize that it's not very detailed, and there are just a couple of points with some very short explanations in a comment for each row. So it feels like there is not a lot of information there, but I think it's actually a good start. There are like 22 requirements. Some of them are very non-precise, like high availability, high durability, and stuff like that. But I think that what we have there might be enough to start scoring some, at least some solutions. We of course may want to describe the requirements a bit better. I do also realize that probably not all of them are there, but yeah, I think that the document I created might be a good starting point for the collaboration.
Marshall, do you want to verbalize your point while you're writing it?
Yeah, so just following up from the conversation we were just having in Slack, is my understanding correct that like the idea with introducing Minio is to like basically remove all touch points with NFS and just completely deprecate that so that the application is only using an S3 compatible API everywhere?
So I think that removing, like making it possible to have a storage that does not depend on NFS should be in the requirements for solution, like by shipping min.io is one of the solutions, right? So, but I think that decoupling GitLab from NFS for everyone, not only in the cloud native installation, but everywhere else, that might be a requirement. But we need to decide, because it's interesting. So what happens when there is a single node installation with one or two engineers working on it? Do we want to store files on disk in there, or do we want to have a solution like min.io that would be the same everywhere, basically, right? In case of a bit larger installation, we would replace min.io with something else, but like this is a balance I believe we need to find, and there is no good answer on how we want to solve that yet. I believe, I might be mistaken, Jason might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like this is one of the decisions that this working group need, or one of the questions that this working group needs to find an answer for, how we want to approach the NFS compatibility.
Right, and this actually it's that, but also one of the main reasons that it was brought up is to remove dual path. So you either are just object storage or NFS, instead of going, okay, which one am I and which route do I take? So right now we end up in a situation where it's complicated because we don't have a single method. So when a functionality that's handling data that's not GET is developed, they develop it first on the file system and then bolt on object storage. What we're trying to do by possibly packaging min.io or some other S3 compatible item is to make object storage not only first class, but first option.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. But we're not going as far as to say that like we want to migrate people off of their existing NFS installations onto like Minio backed by NFS.
So min.io should never be backed by NFS, and that's something of how min.io works. Okay.
Well, I just mean like disk back storage, like not necessarily NFS as like a protocol specifically.
So yes, effectively, in the future, we actually only want to have one code path, right?
Okay. Yeah.
we want to stop going, is object storage present or not, and just go, object storage is present. This is where
Right.
my bucket is. This is where I put my files.
Right.
Rather than having both. That's the true end goal. At some point, that will mean that we have to do rake tasks and things that actually do migrations of things that currently have the ability to sit on the file system that need to be moved to object storage. And that's not just uploads. That's also every other component that we have and interact with that can be file or object based, including the registry as an example.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that one of the many solutions is to build this artifact registry. Like it might be a gateway, it might be a fully fledged artifacts registry, but then the question of how do we handle files stays the same. Like, is that a single registry that will obviously persist files on disk, and how do we scale that solution if someone wants to move to multi-node installation? And I think this is a quite important discussion, and I added this requirement called single code path or single storage place, decoupled from NFS, into the requirements. I think this is very important, but still it's not clear how to achieve that, and whether it should be min.io or something else with a bit that we can have better control over.
Right. To be clear, there are concerns in terms of licensing and bindings and things like this with whatever provider of object storage we end up using. I don't want to focus on that because that's a separate point and research spike. Okay. The important part is understanding whether we should expect and treat this as a not only first class, but first option, and what our path is to get there. However, the main reason that this group is around is because object storage is so disparate and implemented in too many ways. So they all tie together, but they focus on let's get one contiguous implementation, and then let's make it first class, and then let's make it default, kind of in that order of operation.
Yeah,
I mean,
that
they
makes sense
can
to
be
me.
done in parallel, but in terms of rank and precedence, I believe that's what we have.
Thank you, Jason, for making this so clear. I mean, I'm happy that how you just described this makes a lot of sense in all the process that we had done around this. Yeah, I completely agree with you on this. Okay. Shall we move on to the next item?
Like before we do, what are our expectations about what should happen with these scoring document or requirements document? Do we want to review the requirements, add more, remove some, or do some initial scoring on min.io? Or like I think we should have some kind of an action point after the meeting about what should happen next with this document.
I think that we need solutions. We can't score solution if we don't have them, because those are, I mean, those are names, but no solution. min.io in itself is not a solution. It's just the removal of a pain point. It's an enabler for doing some of the improvement that we need, but that's not a solution.
Yes, I agree with that. So yeah, so solutions, and how do we fund them?
Yeah, that's a good point. I wrote one that covers some of the aspect, not all of them. It's point number 2, but I mean, we can discuss it. I mean, it's just 1 point away.
So that's the column F, carrier wave replacement, and that's where we would score your proposal. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you like to call it carrier wave replacement, yeah, that's the column for it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Grzegorz, could you explain a bit more about this scoring system and like what exactly you're trying to achieve by having this
Yeah, so
formulated
we
in this
want
way?
to be a bit more objective because it feels like there are many solutions to our problems. So the idea here is to enumerate all the requirements and things that we want to achieve and do some kind of scoring that would make it easier to understand what. I'm sorry, I need to do something with this kid. We'll be back in like 5 minutes.
Okay, I guess that's an answer as well.
Yeah, I don't know if this was brought up on a previous call, but what's the difference between the stateless and stateful artifact registry? Like what? I don't even know what a stateful
That's
artifact
what I'm
registry would be.
asking, Marshall, as well. Like I'm trying to understand this sheet as well,
Okay.
because it's the first time I hear the explanations given this way, and also there is another level that I want to discuss when Grzegorz is back.
Okay.
See how I
So-
summoned him? Grzegorz back.
Yeah,
There you
I'm
go.
back. I'm sorry. So yeah, the Netflix series ended, and I had to switch to the next one. So yeah, so the idea here is to replicate what we did in the IC gearing working group. This was how Eric approached this problem of having multiple competing solutions and uncertainty around which one is the best one. So and it's kind of objective because we do have requirements and we can score how well given solution falls into requirements to make it a bit more visible which one of the solutions might be a preferred solution. So this is why I suggested creating this Google spreadsheet with this naive scoring like 0, 10. There is probably a better way, but if there are like proposals and ideas about how we can make like it even more objective and transparent, then I'm all ears. But that's the initial idea.
While you were away, we were wondering what the difference between stateless and stateful artifact registry would be, and specifically, like I feel like a artifact registry would be stateless by default, so I don't understand what a stateful one would look like.
Yeah. So basically, these are just placeholders for solutions. I'm not suggesting any of them just yet, except of do nothing. Like that's also an option that I'm quite certain that we don't want to choose. But I put these two stateful stateful and stateless registries there because I imagine that stateless would be something like container registry before being integrated with its own database, where it does not own the objects that are in there. Like it holds them, but it's Rails side that owns them. And stateful would be like the container registry with database where the objects are being tracked within the boundary of the artifacts registry.
That makes sense. So the stateless, you mean like a pure object storage backed registry, and
Yes.
the latter is, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
But of
Can we
course,
name it
these are
that way?
like just that's the first proposal. I was just writing this creating this Google Doc with. I just wanted to put some solutions in there, but these were not being discussed in this working group yet. So we can always remove them or change them.
Let's try to update this right now because the question is going to be asked immediately. Marshall, you suggested, what was it? Object storage backed registry, right? Or maybe we can edit one of the other just to make sure that we have a bit of clarity between the two.
Well, so now that I understand what was meant by stateful artifact registry, like the proposal that I came forward with a couple weeks ago or whenever it was to basically just like leverage our existing container registry implementation, and whether we spin up a separate instance of that for other artifact types aside from containers, or leverage the same instance as like an implementation detail as far as I'm concerned. But I think, yeah, that would fall under stateful, just given that that's the architecture that our container registry is based on now. And I think there are good reasons to do that. Like it makes sense for performance, especially like listing objects, but
I like the only question I had is just to make those cells more clearer for future consumption. I'm not for one solution or another. So
yeah, I
if
was just about
someone
to,
can edit it up, thanks.
yeah, I was about to link.
So just to clarify a few things, I believe that, of course, every solution is stateful. It is a matter of where the state is being stored. So this is when we think about the solution, we need to actually think about where the boundaries are, where the ownership is, and we know that there are two solutions to owning the object's metadata, but there is third thing that we have not discussed yet is who owns the business rules of handling uploads and objects. Like right now, most of the business rules are in Rails. Some of them are in Workhorse. But one of the solutions that I envision we could describe is also a solution where all the business rules around the uploads are also being handled by, like, are being owned by this artifacts registry solution. So that's another aspect of it's not only about who owns objects metadata, but also who owns business rules around handling them, transforming them, encrypting them.
And by that, you mean that like we're literally talking about where the API would be implemented? Is that what you mean by who owns the business rules?
Yeah, probably. Like I guess it might be more complex than that, but imagine, for example, what needs to happen with a file so that we transform that, or for example, where we encrypt that. Right now, there is this proposal of managing secure files inside GitLab, and I think Darby Frey is implementing this right now to store signing keys for mobile applications. So that's yet another set of business rules that our Rails application will need to handle to encrypt files. We could actually implement that in Go and push that to a different place, right, to make it a bit more efficient and closer to where the files are actually being stored. But that's another solution I
Grzegorz,
that we'll be able to.
are we ready to get to the grading process?
Like without talking about solutions, I'm not sure. We probably should enumerate a few, discuss them, whether these are feasible or not, and then we could actually score them. But it feels like we have not discussed yet possible solutions in this work.
Okay. And then another thing that I think is a bit different to the IC gearing working group is that there was a clear DRI for who's going to execute what. Here, grading things without actually knowing that there is going to be a backing of engineering power behind it is going to be another dimension we need to consider. So I would kind of go down two parallel paths here, or rather, I would suggest that we go to two parallel paths here. This working group can continue working on figuring out what kind of options we have, getting to the point where we can actually go down the grading route. There is another parallel point, which is how do we get to the baseline from which we can actually start working on any of the solutions that we select. Right now, from everything I understand about what is investigated and what was done, we have 4 different types of implementations in GitLab, or how object storage is being treated. We need to get that down to a certain manageable number. B, we have a glaring problem with carrier wave, right? It just does not scale anymore, and it's creating problems left and right. So we need to consider addressing that. So it's not even about carrier wave replacement. It's about getting the situation to the point, the status to the point where carrier wave is no longer a problem.
How I understand what you are saying is that you want us to produce the strategy for the short-term solution and long-term solution.
Correct.
And I think that this working group should be eventually responsible for producing both strategies. And this can happen in parallel, but it might be a bit more efficient to advise on the short-term solution when we know what is the long-term solution, because this way we could, strive for a bit more efficiency here. But it's not.
I tend to disagree on that one a bit, because you've seen how these things happen when you actually start developing, right? We have some general ideas of what short term we can actually do. When we start working on it and implementing, we'll be guided with that. So instead of tying these two things immediately together, I still think we need to get to a baseline point where we can then see how that short-term strategy will be impacted by the long-term one, right? So I still think there is some prep work prior to developing a full short-term strategy that we can do.
Yeah, I need to think about that, but I kind of agree with you. There's probably something we can do to improve the situation in the short term. Yeah, it's just not clear to me. Perhaps what I'm missing here is to define the goals of the working group itself. Because obviously the working group cannot be responsible for doing stuff. There's no capacity within the working group to do stuff in most cases. I don't think it's feasible for the working group team members to actually even improve object storage situation in the short term. That probably should be an engineering allocation. And long-term solution, that's complete different beast, something that it needs a budget and it's a bit more difficult. But yeah, so my suggestion is to actually refine the objectives and the goals of the working group to make it more explicit of what the outcome of our meetings should be, perhaps.
Yeah, in regard of the short-term goal, I think that there is the proposal that I made on point 2 is really focusing on the pain point and is kind of it's achievable in a couple of milestones, I would say, and it's still is just tidying up things so that then we can think about where do we want to move, which is the next solution, rather than just thinking what's the perfect solution. Is more about we have things that are working, things that are not working, how can we fix things together, and yeah, and then we have a baseline where we can say, okay, this is what we have, is not dissimilar to how we store metadata today. So in terms of we are not going to do big data migrations or things like that. There's no, for instance, there's no object storage interaction in terms of migrating information to one place to another one. We can handle everything on background migration just to realign database and things like that. And then when we have a baseline implementation, we can say, okay, we really want to move this to the OCI artifact registry. Fine, we have one thing to migrate, which is a base solution, and we migrate it. Or we want to build, we decide to build the components because we have more control over it. Fine, it's still one thing to migrate.
So that's interesting. So I feel like it's usually much easier to iterate on something when you know where you are going. In that regard, I feel like knowing what the ideal solution might be, or semi-ideal, like I don't think we need to strive for perfect solutions here, but good enough solutions are good enough. So if we know what the good enough solution might be, we can iterate toward it a bit more, responsive. Like I'm not sure how to explain that, but it feels like without knowing what this good enough solution is going to be, we might do a lot of work that we will need to either revert or somehow extend or augment. But one thing that I actually fully agree with is it's going to be infinitely easier to iterate towards any solution if we decouple stuff. And that's why the proposal of replacing carrier wave sounds quite good to me, because it decouples stuff from carrier wave, Rails, active model, and it makes it much easier to iterate into any direction we decide we want to go. So yeah.
Just a quick question. Does this proposal, Alessia, and I know we are at time, does this proposal exclude any future solutions that we might come up with?
No, it doesn't, because it's basically is tidying up what is in a message state, and then it's still we can choose a solution and migrate to that one.
And like, do I understand the proposal correctly that this is really focused on the direct upload use case? Is that what you mean by attachments?
Yeah. So
Okay.
I mean, this is kind of trying to bring everything on par with direct upload, so that everything can go through the thing, and then we have a baseline where we can migrate to the next solution. The important bits here is that there is the strong decouple between database callback, so it's active model callbacks and object storage API. We treat those two things as two separate entities, and you will never wait for an API call during database transaction and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So just a quick thing before I drop off. I would like to know whether it would be possible for all of you, or most of you, to actually align whether this is a solution that we can consider, because for this type of solution and with this size, I can actually find a way to fund the effort and actually get a move on, which would theoretically free up all of you to actually continue investigating what is the actual long-term solution we want to strive for. By that time, we might, like, if I manage to find someone to fund this effort and they start working on this, they'll get acquainted with the situation enough so that they can actually catch up relatively quickly with whatever the solution might end up being for the long term. But I would need to know whether this is something that most of you want to get behind, and whether this is something that will actually buy us some time, which is, I think, what I'm asking here the most. Like, buy us some time so that we don't deal with incidents, security holes, and so on, so that we can work towards a larger change when it comes to like the long term of object storage. Sorry, I need to drop off, but thanks a bunch for the discussion. Really enjoyed it, and hope you have a good holidays if you're celebrating.
Thank you. So I think we can answer this question. I mean, we are past time. We can answer this question synchronously. It's just a matter of just asking everyone to take a look at that proposal, see if it's adding extra complexity, if it's removing complexity, if it's going in a, is it simplifying or not? So if we think it's falling short somewhere, and then we can make a decision. I mean, if we can get this off of our plate and continue working on what do we think is the long-term solution, that's a win-win situation.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Oh, okay. We are at time. There are a couple of things. I would just do a quick announcement. I would not be here for the next 2 weeks. There are Jason and Matthias that volunteered for doing the facilitator role in those next weeks. So just keep things going while I'm not here. And